Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to Eye on Islam, the show where we look at current affairs through an Islamic lens. Each week we'll look at a trending news story which has a direct relevance to the religion of Islam, and we'll break it down from a Muslim perspective. On today's show, we'll be talking about the hijab and the debate regarding hijab laws in Muslim countries like the Islamic Republic of Iran. So let's kick off this episode with a deep dive into the violent protests which have emerged following the unfortunate death of Iranian woman Mahsa Amini in September of this year. Her death saw a rapid rise in Islamophobic anti-hijab sentiment being expressed by the various radical groups who seem to have hijacked her name as part of a movement campaigning for the destruction of Islam in Iran and elsewhere.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has come under a sustained attack from a persistent, violent protest movement in recent weeks, with anti-Iran demonstrators seemingly obsessed with criticism of Iran's laws on modesty and compulsory hijab. The riots first broke out in Iran in mid-September after the death of Iranian woman Mahsa Amini. The 22-year-old fainted at a police station in Tehran and was pronounced dead 3 days later in hospital. An official report by Iran's legal medicine organization concluded that Amini's death was caused by illness rather than alleged blows to the head or other vital body organs. However, her death was quickly adopted as a means by various groups to attempt to topple the government.
They've got an agenda. I feel like they are well supported by the British, by the West, by the Israelis, and that's what they do.
Footage has gone viral showing protesters burning hijabs, attacking mosques, and desecrating spiritual artwork. In response to the violence, millions of Iranians have marched across Iran over multiple occasions this year, defending the hijab and condemning attacks against Iranian security forces by demonstrators. The unrest has been used as a precursor to renew Western debate over Iran's mandatory hijab laws and women's rights from a Western perspective.
Well, joining us in the studio today to talk about the importance of the hijab in Islam and the anti-Iran protests, we have Sister Batool Subeiti, a political activist and commentator based here in London. And also joining me is Sheikh Taqi Rizvi. He is a scholar based in London who has been involved in Islamic dissemination amongst the youth for the last 3 decades and works in community activities, both religious and social. Thank you to both of you for joining me on the show, and assalamu alaikum to you both. Perhaps I could come straight to you, Sayyid, and ask you about what does Islam say about the hijab? What's the position of the hijab in Islam?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think what's really important to understand, hijab is not an item of just clothing, but it's a existence of an individual in relation to what they can associate with and cannot associate with. And Quran and various aspects of the Quran and traditions quite clearly talk about association in the sense of mahram and non-mahram. In other words, those who are immediate family and those who are not immediate family. And that's where the hijab comes in, because whilst one associates with immediate family, in other words, the various parts of the ayats of the surah, the 2 ayats mainly in Surah Nur, which is the 24th surah of the Quran, which ayat number 30 and 31, in which they quite clearly say, I mean, there's the ayat which says to the men that they should lower their gaze, and there's the ayat number 30 which says to the women that they should lower their gaze. Whilst Islam does say, I mean, the ayat which is number 31 quite clearly says that who one can interact with. It says that you can interact with you can appear without a hijab with your husbands, your husband's father, your husband's children, sons. So there's that interaction which is permissible. But the reality is that we know in social life that there is an interaction which is permissible, but all those interactions also have their own categories. You know, like you have a female who can appear in a particular manner in front of her husband, she cannot appear in that particular manner in front of her father. And society would condemn the woman if she tried to appear in the manner that she appears in front of her husband, as she would appear in front of her father. When society has these prerogatives and pre- previously set standards, Islam goes a little bit further and says, look, because women are not just left to be locked up in the home, they will interact with men, they will interact with people who are not their mahram, not their immediate family. Therefore, when that takes place, then Islam says, well, make sure that you then interact with in such a manner that you will not be infringing the rights of those who are not your mahram to see you, and likewise you will not be doing something which is contradicting your religious responsibilities in relation to interaction. And that ayat which I said, the 30th ayat of Surah Nur, it says to men as well, that if they come across women who are not their immediate families, immediate relatives, then they too must lower their gaze.
So it seems to me like the concept of hijab is quite differently seen. It's a different perspective from the Muslim world. It's about protecting the woman and giving her an opportunity to enter into the public space in a protected manner. I'm going to come to you, Sister Batool, now and ask for your opinion. You're obviously a practicing hijabi. You wear it quite proudly, I see. Could you just tell me, are you oppressed?
It's very funny, actually. The whole crux of the hijab is to free you from everything apart from God and submission to God. So the primary reason for why I wear the hijab is out of sheer and pure obedience to God. So I view it less as a choice of how to dress and more of a choice of whether or not I'm submitting to God the Almighty. From a secondary perspective, also just to echo what the Sayyid was saying, I do believe the hijab is an essential component of a healthy society. For me personally, I believe it has prevented me from being in many otherwise unideal or harmful situations. Of course, being a representative of Islam, it always keeps me in check. I believe it has also protected me from the lustful gaze of men. I also believe it's a protection for men themselves to not fall prey to that due to the way that God has created both males and females. I also believe the essence of the hijab is to restore equality between the males and the females. It's to remove the element of discrimination that relegates a woman's potential and worth to her level of sexual attraction. So essentially, it's there to facilitate the interaction of women and their participation in wider society rather than to limit. And I'll end by saying also that I think the body is a very private entity and reality of a woman. It should be respected. It should be honored. And the whole essence of the hijab is to basically ensure that it's safeguarded, both the body and the soul, from moral corruption.
Because I know that the other side of the argument might suggest, well, actually it's liberating for a woman to wear less rather than more. What's your response to that?
I mean, that's very funny, I would say, because actually a tool of social control, and the capitalists themselves and those at the top, they actually relish out of creating money from this industry of sexualizing women and actually utilizing women for their own satisfaction. The hijab comes and says, do you know what, we want you to be the most effective when you interact with society, so this is how you should interact to minimize instincts, because you are worthy as an entity and your output for society is what worthy, not the way that you look.
Fantastic. And Sayyid, let me come back to you on this. About the hijab again, I wonder about what Islam's position is on the fact that there are laws in Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, which are now in place, which basically make women have to wear it in the public space, even women who potentially don't want to wear it if given the choice. What's the Islamic view on that? Should that be the case in Muslim majority countries?
I mean, look at a tradition from Hazrat Fatima Zahra Salamu Alayha. When she was passing away, she writes a will to Mawla Ali, Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, and she says that when my body is being carried, I don't want to be carried with just a sheet on my body, for I will be visualized by people who will see my body being carried to the grave. I want to be put in a tabut. I want to be put in a coffin, such that my respectability, even to my death, is kept to me, not enabled others who want to abuse that respectability that the Holy Prophet had granted me be seen and visualized. And what the sister says is quite interesting, that, and it's important. There's a tradition from Mawla Ali. He says a female should keep herself busy in demonstrating obedience to the Creator, rather than be busy in how she impresses her appearance to others. And that's a very important tradition, because in obedience to the Creator, every aspect of one's behavior, life, then is generated around that of protecting oneself to be close to the Creator, rather than close to the eyes of those who want to abuse the appearance of the individual. So these traditions are quite strong. I mean, and then of course we have the issues regarding Karbala, where Imam Hussein's family was taken as asir, as prisoners, to Yazid's audience, and there even the ladies were trying to hide behind each other to prevent themselves from being seen by the those present in Yazid's domain. So, you know, that aspect of self-protection is more in the definition rather than it be defined as mandatory imposing of something.
And I just want to make this point very clear as well. How important is the hijab in Islam? Because I know that there might be kind of like a reformist mentality coming out of the West now where even among Muslims they're arguing, well, how important is the hijab? Do I really have to wear it?
You see, hijab, or a clothing of modesty, was something which even in the West was well respected. Even in the Victorian, they would say, oh, that's Victorian and now we're progressing. But the point is, it's not the issue of the item, it's the changing of its use, where the liberation is being given to take the woman out of dressing. But it's really interesting. One of these Somalian ladies was being given a award in the United Nations, and she went in her full hijab. So somebody asked her, why are you in hijab? So she says, you know, in the times when people were walking around without clothes, we called them barbaric. And now you want me to return to the environment of the barbaric lives where I'm without clothes? So that is the reality.
That's an interesting point, yes.
Yeah,
it's double standards.
It's double standard because whilst you are promoting the removal of barbaric appearance, you're telling people who are in decent appearance to become barbaric.
Yes, it's double standards there. We're going to continue this discussion. Okay, before we continue our discussion on the hijab and Islam, let's have a look at some other Islamic stories that have been trending lately. The US men's football team have caused outrage by displaying Iran's national flag on social media without the Allah emblem of the Islamic Republic. Ahead of the two nations' recent World Cup match, the US team also said they support so-called protesters in Iran. According to FIFA regulations, the US soccer team should have been punished with a 10-match suspension for violating Iran's religious identity, but this didn't happen. Newly released census data shows that there are now 3.9 million Muslims in England and Wales, an increase of 1.2 million people over the last decade. This means there are now around 4 million Muslims living in the UK if the Muslim populations of Scotland and Northern Ireland are taken into account. London is the place with the highest concentration of Muslims. There are now over 1.3 million Muslims living in the British capital. And Islamic Party PAS has emerged as one of the biggest winners in Malaysia's general election, which was won by the reformist candidate Anwar Ibrahim. PAS, which has long been a powerhouse in northeast Malaysia, is now a national force by winning the most seats of any party. It espouses Islamic law for Malaysia, which runs contrary to Anwar's vision of a multicultural society. Protests against Islam and Iran have remained ongoing for a number of weeks, and not that long ago I decided to attend one of these rallies in London, which luckily didn't turn violent, but gave me a chance to find out who are the protesters and what are the ideologies we're dealing with as part of this movement. A warning that some of the views expressed in this next clip will probably be offensive to some of our Muslim viewers. Few could be surprised about the regime change mission of the anti-Iran protesters. But what may be lesser known is the militant Islamophobic Western ideologies which have essentially hijacked Mahsa Amini's name to further their own personal agendas. At one of the London rallies, it was clear that each protester had their own views on what they ultimately wanted to force onto Iranians.
I'm protesting for freedom, regime change, and hopefully we will gain also freedom for women.
All sexual orientations, human rights is for everybody, every single human, not people with assigned genders dictating for everyone how to be. And Iran is actually Farsi is a genderless language. We need a regime change in Iran.
It seems to me like maybe this incident that occurred is growing into something more, like maybe there are more causes that are getting involved now. Do you think that's true, like maybe the LGBT movement?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Militant Western feminism, LGBT activists, and Kurdish nationalism, just a few of the ideologies which had clearly linked up to push their own self-centered worldviews onto Mahsa Amini and the anti-Iran movement as a whole, with the ambition to ultimately destroy one of the Middle East's Islamic republics. Welcome back to the discussion now, where I've been discussing the hijab and Islam with my two expert guests. Now I'm going to come straight back to you, Sister Batool, about what's happening here. So I spoke to some of these activists. It's quite clear that they want much more for Iran than just freedom and human rights and so on and so forth. They want things like regime change. They want the rainbow propaganda machine to be flying the flag in Tehran, that type of thing. A lot of militant feminists want to completely remove clothes entirely, which I think is a bit too far even for some liberal standards. Just tell me, why is the hijab specifically the kind of target for these type of radical Western groups? Why are they burning it?
Right, because it's ultimately the symbolism of the hijab in terms of what it is representing. Now, I don't think they have a problem in and of itself with the practice of the hijab per se as a practice. Rather, it is the spirit of Islam. It is the spirit of Islam that says no to any form of cultural hegemony or submission to the dictates of any oppressive law or man-made law that is outside of the trajectory of God's law. So essentially, that is the crux of the issue that they have. So the way that I look at them is that these individuals are brainwashed, and these individuals have fell into the trap of the soft war campaign of the West, that inherently the reason that it attacks Iran is because Iran has this strong, independent line, and ultimately the West wants the whole trajectory of the world to submit to their cultural hegemony and to their dictates and to their rules. So I think naturally in that circumstance, it would view the hijab as a threat in terms of being the symbol for a true free Islam. So for example, you won't see them complain about the hijab in Saudi Arabia, for example, because Saudi Arabia essentially is acting as a client state for the US. So they don't have a problem with that kind of hijab. They have a problem with the spirit that accompanies the true philosophy and embodiment and practice of the hijab, that is submission to none other than God. And they are the hegemons of the world, and they want to maintain that unjust status quo. So naturally, the real philosophy of the hijab will be a threat to them.
And how important do you think the hijab has been with with Islam in general in countries like Iran? How important is it for the national identity there?
Absolutely. As I have just mentioned, the true embodiment of the hijab is one of freeing the individual from all that restricts them and ultimate submission to God. And that is the trajectory that Iran has taken in 1979. So I would argue that Iran, the Islamic Republic, is a true Islamic Republic in the real sense of the world, because this was the will of the people. The strength of the system in Iran ultimately rests on the people. It was the people that came out on the streets and said, no East, no West, Islamic Republic. And you had a 98% votes for this with a 90% voter turnout. And ultimately, the only reason that Iran is standing today is because of the people. Because if we look at 40 years of embargoes, sieges and sanctions and conspiracies of the worst kinds, from assassinations to defamation campaigns to a literal military campaign for 8 years in the Iran-Iraq war, all of that is designed to do what? It's designed to crush the spirit of the Iranian people. But ultimately, not only has that not succeeded, it has backfired. Today, Iran has the strongest, I would argue, economy in the world because it's self-sufficient, because it's reliant upon itself. Now, what does it mean to be reliant upon itself? It means it's reliant on its domestic capabilities. So no matter how many times we see these protesters coming out, another great evidence is that you will see 10 times the amount of these protesters coming in Iran to defend the ideals of the revolution. We see this on the anniversary of the revolution in Bahman. We see this during Al-Quds Day, which is reaffirming the values of the revolution. We see this when individuals are assassinated, whether it's Haj Qasim Soleimani, who's considered a national hero, or Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was a nuclear scientist, for example. These are all evidence and indicators that truly the system rests on the people, and they are a minority who are protesting.
I think it's also really interesting that there's clearly double standards at play here, because a lot of these movements are condemning Muslim countries for basically being Muslim, but then they're not speaking up for Muslim women living in Europe, for example, who are being told, no, you can't wear the burqa, you can't wear the hijab in some circumstances, and basically oppressing their rights to choose what they want to wear. So blatant hypocrisy in that standard as well. Saeed, I'm going to come back to you on this. There are clearly debates going on even among Muslims regarding the hijab and so on and so forth. It's a challenge, I think, for Muslims in the West specifically to have to wear it, to have to live an Islamic lifestyle among non-Muslims amid the Islamophobic atmosphere that we live in as well. What's your advice to women who are perhaps struggling with this issue of the hijab?
I think main important thing is that one establishes one's own religiosity about what this is all about, because as there was just a report recently which said that, now the level of Christianity is also dropped below 50% in the community. That's because they're identifying themselves more with atheism and consequently the disobedience to the Creator. And hijab and all these other aspects of self-protection is something which is a universal thing. In Surah Shams, Quran says, فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has inspired the soul to understand good and bad. And understanding good and bad is within the domains of the environment that one is living in. That when one sees suppression of women's rights, in the sense of Islam doesn't talk about equality, Islam talks about equity, in the sense of that which is the that which is a right of the individual to have, not that which is just given to the person because somebody else feels that is somebody's right to have. And that's where it's so important that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's understanding of human needs are quite clearly nurtured in the behavior of the human being and how they behave with people around them. Obviously, not only just in Britain or in Western countries where Muslim women are stressed in trying to identify themselves as an identity of what form they should take, it's something which has been imposed in Muslim countries during the time of the colonial powers, and how they made people unhijabed, in the sense how they promoted women who were more freer to hang around with colonial powers. Then they gave them more powers and more positions. And they used women as tools of espionage in Muslim countries to get, one of those individuals who was well known for her espionage and behavior was Gertrude Bell. And how she interacted without hijab, so as to say, within the Muslim elite, pulling the elite towards the desire to have worse social behaviors than to promote good social behaviors. And of course, the strength of the Islamic leadership in the form of the Maraji, who gave the rulings of how important the hijab is for sisters to possess for themselves, that played a major part in making sure that we understood how we should interact with the item of protection.
For sure. Now, we haven't got very long left of the show, so I'm going to come back to you, sister, for a final take. Could you just tell me about how is it that Mahsa Amini, I've never met Mahsa, but she doesn't seem like, a militant Western feminist advocate to me. How is it that her name, her brand, became hijacked essentially by these Western groups?
Right, I think by now people probably know that there were 275 million tweets in the name of Mahsa Amini. That is not normal. That magnitude of systemic campaign and aggression against the Islamic Republic on Iran on something that was supposedly alleged tells you that surely there's a greater game at play here. Ultimately, I don't believe that the West is hell-bent, quote-unquote, on regime change in Iran. And the reason I will say this is because they're not naive. They know Iran has reached a position of strength where there is no going back, essentially. They've tried every single means and tactics that exists for them to fragment the nation. I mean, we saw this with the 2009 quote-unquote Green Revolution, right? We saw that when the moment tens of Iranians came out on the streets when they felt like there might be a threat on the government, that they ultimately drowned those protesters. We saw that. So ultimately, what the West is seeking to do right now is to apply internal pressure through unleashing its underground collaborator networks and their underground hidden cells in order to wreak havoc, to pressurize Iran. So perhaps it might be able to get some concessions on an international scene. It was a pretext to also put sanctions, for example, on Iran to weaken it. But it's not quote-unquote regime change. That's too far.
Basically using dirty tactics to try and get what they want out of Iran. And I think it's worth mentioning that there were huge protests in support of the Islamic Republic during this whole affair. That's something worth mentioning as well. But thank you very much to both of my guests today. It's been a very enlightening discussion, to say the least. But that's all the time we have for this edition of Eye on Islam. But join us next week for another edition. And for now, Salaam Alaikum.